The chapel at Whitfield Park had been dressed in white roses since dawn. Every pew was filled with someone the season would have recognized, silk rustling against silk in shades of cream and pearl, and the morning light through the tall east windows fell across the assembled faces with the generous equality that light affords, and people do not. The Marquis of Whitfield stood at the altar in a coat of charcoal gray, his back straight, his hands still at his sides, his expression fixed in the particular discipline the county had long since stopped trying to penetrate. Beside him, Miss Augusta Poole waited in ivory satin, and a veil so fine it seemed to float above her dark hair rather than rest upon it. The Reverend Mr. Talbot had opened his book. The first words of the ceremony had been spoken into the hush. And then the door at the back of the chapel opened, and Cecilia Ashworth walked in wearing lavender. She had not meant to be seen. That much was clear from the angle of her entry. The way she pressed close to the far wall, as though she might pass through stone if she only held still enough. Her gown was plain, well made once and carefully maintained since, the color of lilac past its peak, the color a woman wears when grief has not yet fully released her, and she does not pretend that it has. Her gloves were gray. Her bonnet was modest. She carried nothing except a small leather prayer book, and she did not look toward the altar. She did not need to. The Marquis of Whitfield had already seen her. If you have ever arrived in a room where you were not expected, where your very presence changed the temperature of the air simply by being wrong for it, then you know what happened inside that chapel. Stay with this one. It was Lord Whitfield's hands that gave him away first, not his face, which remained as composed as carved limestone. His right hand rose to the breast of his coat and pressed there, once, against something hidden in the inner pocket, and then dropped. His jaw shifted by a fraction that only someone watching very closely would have caught. His gaze, which had been fixed on the middle distance with the precision of a man who has rehearsed looking at nothing, moved. He looked past the clergyman, past the white roses, past Miss Poole's ivory veil, to the back of the chapel where a woman in lavender stood against the wall with a prayer book in her hands and her eyes on the floor. For 3 full seconds he did not speak. He did not blink. He did not breathe in any way that the front pew could verify. Miss Poole noticed. Her chin lifted by a degree. Lady Whitfield, the dowager, seated in the first pew with her hands folded and her posture communicating 40 years of unchallenged authority, noticed too, her lips pressed together. And in the space between one breath and the next, her eyes found Cecilia Ashworth against the far wall and dismissed her with a fluency that required no words at all. The companion. That was what they had called her for 6 months. In drawing rooms and at card tables, over breakfast trays and in whispered asides at assemblies. The companion. As though the word were a door that, once shut, need never be opened again. What no one in that chapel understood yet was that the door had never been shut at all. 10 months before this morning, Cecilia Ashworth had been Sir Edmund Ashworth's only daughter, the keeper of his modest library in Hertfordshire, the manager of his correspondence, the quiet spine of a household that ran on her attention and her father's kindness. Ashworth Lodge had been small, its gardens overgrown in a way that suggested preference rather than neglect, its shelves crowded, its hearth warm. Sir Edmund had been a man of moderate means and immoderate generosity, the sort of father who read aloud after supper and who knew the name of every tenant's child, and who had never, in 23 years, made his daughter feel that her worth required a husband to confirm it. He died on a Tuesday in November, suddenly, with a letter half written on his desk, and his spectacles still warm on the side table. Cecilia had found him in his chair by the fire, his hand resting on the arm as though he had simply paused mid-thought, and for one terrible moment She had believed he was sleeping. The debt surfaced within the week. £2,000 owed to creditors whose patience had outlived Sir Edmund's charm and would not outlive his absence. The house was sold before Christmas. The library went with it, the marginalia in her father's hand carried away in crates by a bookseller who paid £12 for the lot and did not ask the name of the man who had written in every margin. The piano her mother had played, the one with the chipped key at middle C, was sold to a family in Surrey, whose name she never learned. By the new year, she owned what she could carry, and what she could carry fit inside a single trunk and a leather prayer book with a sprig of dried lavender pressed between its pages. The lavender had come from the garden at Ashworth Lodge, cut on the last morning when the ground was frozen and the stems snapped rather than bent. She had pressed it into the book because her hands needed something to do that was not trembling. By January she was in Derbyshire, Lady Penhurst of Hartwell Cottage, a kind, half-deaf woman of 70, whose joints ached in the damp and whose eyes could no longer follow a printed line without pain, had offered £40 per annum, a south-facing room, and the particular mercy of expecting nothing from Cecilia except her voice and her competence. The role was companion. The word sat in Cecilia's mouth like a stone she could not quite swallow and could not quite spit out, because to reject it was to reject the roof over her head, and she had learned very quickly what it meant to need a roof. Hartwell Cottage sat at the edge of a larger estate. Whitfield Park, the seat of the Marquis of Whitfield, spread across the valley to the north and east, its grounds visible from Lady Penhurst's morning room if one stood at the window and looked past the low garden wall. Cecilia had stood there in her first weeks, watching the deer move across the distant park in the gray February light, and had thought nothing of the house or its owner, except that great houses looked different when you had recently lost a small one. She did not know then that the Marquis had returned from London in February, earlier than the household expected, with no explanation offered and none demanded. She did not know that his mother, the Dowager Marchioness, had already begun her campaign on behalf of Miss Augusta Poole, whose fortune was £30,000, whose family was above reproach, and whose face, by every measure the season applied, was the correct face for a marchioness. She did not know that the Marquis had listened to his mother's case with the same composed attention he gave to matters of estate business, and that he had said nothing in reply, which his mother had taken as agreement, and which was not. The first time Cecilia heard the words spoken about her in the tone that would follow her for the next 6 months, she was standing in the corridor outside Lady Whitfield's private sitting room at Whitfield Park, waiting to deliver a letter Lady Penhurst had written. The door was not fully closed. Lady Whitfield's voice carried the way voices carry when their owners have never had reason to lower them. "She is a companion, Julian. Nothing more." The Marquis's reply was too quiet for Cecilia to hear. She caught only the shape of it, a single sentence spoken without rise or fall, and then his mother's voice again, sharper now, the consonants precise. "Lady Penhurst may bring her to dinner if she likes. That does not make the girl suitable for conversation beyond the foot of the table. A companion is a companion. The word exists precisely so that we need not think further." Cecilia set the letter on the hall table. She walked back to Hartwell Cottage without delivering it. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. The heat at the back of her neck did not reach her eyes, because she had learned in the month since her father's death that grief teaches a woman where to store the things the world is not permitted to see. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself the word was accurate. She was a companion. The role had a salary, a room, a function, and if the function was invisibility, she had grown competent at performing it. What she did not know, and could not have known, was that the Marquis of Whitfield had been watching from the south library window as she crossed the gravel drive back toward Hartwell. He had stood with one hand flat against the glass and the other pressed to the breast of his coat, where something small and hard lived in the inner pocket, and he had watched her until she disappeared through Lady Penhurst's garden gate. His hand at the glass had not moved for a long time after she was gone. They had met 3 weeks earlier at a small dinner Lady Penhurst hosted for her neighbors. Cecilia had been seated at the far end of the table, below the wives and above no one, in the particular position reserved for women whose presence was a function of employment rather than invitation. Lord Whitfield had arrived late, spoken little, and departed early. His face had been composed of straight lines and deliberate silences, and Cecilia had thought, with the precise, critical eye her father had nurtured in her, that the Marquis of Whitfield looked like a man who had been cold for so long he had forgotten that coldness was not the same as strength. She had not expected to think of him again. She had been entirely wrong. He appeared at Hartwell Cottage 3 days after the dinner, on the pretext of delivering a book Lady Penhurst had requested from his library. The book was real. The errand could have been given to any footman on the estate. He came himself. Cecilia was in the morning room, reading aloud from a volume of Cowper, while Lady Penhurst dozed in her chair by the fire. She heard the knock, heard Mrs. Kirby answer, heard the particular quality of stillness that enters a small house when a man of that rank steps into its hall. She did not rise. She finished the stanza. When she looked up, he was standing in the doorway, with the book in one hand, and his hat in the other, and his eyes were on her in a way she could not quite account for. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and level, the words measured out as though each one cost something he was not sure he could afford. "Lady Penhurst's book." "Thank you, my lord." She stood, crossed the room, and took the volume from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. The distance between his hand and hers was perhaps an inch, and the air inside that inch was warmer than it should have been, and her pulse shifted at her wrist in a way she chose to attribute to the surprise of his visit, and nothing more. He did not leave. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and then at the sleeping Lady Penhurst, and then at the fire, and then at her again. And something in his expression changed so briefly that she could not have named it under oath. "You are cold," he said. It was not a question. It was an observation delivered with the authority of a man accustomed to issuing corrections. "The fire has burned too low. Have Mrs. Kirby build it up." "The fire is adequate, my lord." "It is not. Your hands are white. Have it built up." He turned and left before she could reply. His boots on the gravel were the only sound for a long moment, and Cecilia stood in the doorway holding the book he had delivered in person, and feeling the warmth return to her fingers, as though his command had carried its own heat. She told Mrs. Kirby to build up the fire. She told herself it was because the room was cold, which it was, and not because his voice had settled somewhere beneath her ribs in a way she did not intend to examine. He came again the following week, and the week after that. Each visit had a reason: a message for Lady Penhurst, a question about the garden wall, an invitation to a musical evening Cecilia would not be expected at. Each visit lasted precisely as long as courtesy required, and each left Cecilia standing in the morning room with her hands clasped and her heartbeat in her ears, and a growing awareness of exactly where he had stood: the specific floorboard, the angle of his shadow, the air that still carried some trace of leather and wood smoke. The visit stopped when the engagement was announced. She learned of it the way companions learn of things, sideways, from a conversation she was not part of. Mrs. Kirby mentioned it over the morning tea tray, her voice carrying the particular brightness that other people's good fortune produces in those who have none of their own. The Marquis of Whitfield was to marry Miss Augusta Poole. The banns would be read beginning in April. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in June, and the chapel at Whitfield Park was already being measured for flowers. Cecilia's hand had been lifting the teapot when Mrs. Kirby spoke. The hand continued its motion. The tea poured into the cup. The cup did not rattle against the saucer. Nothing visible happened at all, and the nothing that happened was the most disciplined performance of Cecilia Ashworth's life. She did not see Lord Whitfield again for 6 weeks. His visits to Hartwell ceased. She caught sight of him once from Lady Penhurst's morning-room window, riding across the far edge of the park with Miss Poole beside him in a dark blue habit, and the distance between the window and the riders was far enough that she could tell herself the ache beneath her sternum was the weather, or the light, or the particular grief of missing her father that sometimes arrived without warning and lodged itself in odd places. It was during those 6 weeks, at a dinner at Whitfield Park to which Lady Penhurst had been invited and Cecilia brought along as a necessary appendage, that the second voicing landed. The table was longer this time, the guests more numerous, and Cecilia had been placed once again at the far end, where the candle light thinned and the conversation did not quite reach. Lady Whitfield had been speaking to Mrs. Greville, the wife of a neighboring baronet, in the carrying tone of a woman who has never learned the difference between a private aside and a public address. "The companion presumes," she said, and the word fell across the table like a coin dropped on marble. Lady Penhurst indulges her naturally. The old are sentimental. She brings the girl everywhere, as though proximity to her betters might somehow elevate the situation. It will not. Mrs. Greville murmured something Cecilia could not hear. Lady Whitfield's reply was perfectly audible. "A companion is a companion, my dear. One does not set a place for the furniture." Cecilia's hands were in her lap. Her face did not change. Her breath caught once, hard, at the base of her throat, and she released it slowly, through her nose, in a way that no one at the table would have seen unless they were watching her with the specific and undivided attention that one person at that table was. Lord Whitfield, seated at the head, had not spoken during his mother's remark. His fork rested against the edge of his plate, untouched. His eyes were on Cecilia at the far end of the table, and the expression in them was not cold. It was not warm either. It was something else entirely, something held under such pressure that its true shape could not be determined from the outside, only felt, the way one feels the change in the air before a storm arrives. He turned to his mother and said, in the same low-level voice that carried no further than it intended, "Miss Ashworth is Lady Penhurst's guest. She will be treated as one." The table heard it. Lady Whitfield's lips compressed. Miss Poole, seated at her future mother-in-law's right, glanced between them with the quick appraising calculation of a woman who has been told her entire life that she is the answer, and who is beginning, for the first time, to wonder about the question. Cecilia did not look up. She did not look at Lord Whitfield. She looked at her plate and breathed, and the warmth that spread through her chest was something she could not afford and did not refuse. It was 3 days after that dinner, on a cold April morning when the light was thin and gray and the wind pressed against the windows of Hartwell Cottage, that Lord Whitfield saw what he was not meant to see. Lady Penhurst's granddaughter, a girl of 7 named Nell, had been visiting for the week. The child had developed a fever on her second night, the kind that comes on fast in small bodies and leaves the adults around it helpless and afraid. The physician had come and gone. Lady Penhurst had been taken to her own room to rest, too frail to sit vigil. Mrs. Kirby had other duties, and Cecilia had stayed. She had stayed through the night, sitting beside the child's bed with a basin of cool water and a cloth, bathing Nell's forehead, singing to her in a low voice when the girl grew restless, reading to her from a book of fairy tales when the fever ebbed enough for Nell to listen. By morning, Cecilia's eyes were ringed with shadows. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her voice had gone hoarse from the long night's use. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Nell's hand, telling her in a near whisper about the garden at Ashworth Lodge, about the lavender that grew along the south wall and the way it smelled in July, when the door opened and Lord Whitfield was standing there. He had come to inquire after the child on his mother's behalf. That was the reason he would have given. The reason he stayed, leaning against the door frame with his arms folded and his face very still, watching Cecilia Ashworth speak to a sick child about a garden she had lost, was not a reason he would have offered to anyone. Cecilia did not see him. Her back was to the door. She was telling Nell that if you pressed lavender between the pages of a book, it kept its scent for years, that her father's prayer book still smelled of the garden even now, and that some things, if you were careful with them, survived the losing. The Marquis of Whitfield pressed his hand once against the breast of his coat. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor without making a sound, and the expression on his face as he went was the expression of a man who has just recognized something he cannot undo. A week later, on a morning when the rain had paused long enough for the garden to release the particular green scent that Derbyshire produces in late April, Cecilia encountered Lord Whitfield on the path between Hartwell Cottage and the Whitfield Park gate. She was returning from delivering a letter. He was walking from the stables, hatless, his hair damp, his coat unbuttoned as though he had forgotten the basic protocols of weather. They stopped. The path was narrow enough that two people could not pass without one stepping aside, and neither of them stepped aside. "You were with the child," he said. "The night of the fever. Mrs. Kirby told me. Nell is Lady Penhurst's granddaughter. It was my place to be with her." "It was not your place. It was your choice. There is a difference, Miss Ashworth, and you know it." She did not reply. His eyes held hers, and for a moment the careful architecture of distance they had both maintained collapsed into something raw and close and charged, the way the air feels when lightning has struck nearby and the ground still hums with it. "You should eat," he said. His voice was quiet. "You have not eaten properly in days. I can see it in your face." "I was not aware my lord concerned himself with the meals of his mother's neighbor's companions." "Do not," he said, and the word was sharp enough that she flinched. "Call yourself that." He stepped off the path to let her pass. She passed. Their arms did not touch. The distance between them was less than a hand's breadth, and the warmth she felt along her left side, where his body had been close to hers for 3 seconds, remained for the entire walk back to Hartwell, and she pressed her fingers against her own wrist as though checking for a pulse she was not sure she still had a right to feel. That was the last time she saw him before the wedding. If Cecilia's quiet endurance has stayed with you, hold it gently. There is more waiting in this story. What Cecilia did not know, and what no one outside Whitfield Park's private rooms would ever have guessed, was why the Marquis carried himself the way he did, why his face was constructed of such deliberate composure, why his hand returned again and again to the breast of his coat, where something small and oval and cool to the touch lived in the inner pocket. Her name had been Charlotte. She had been his sister. She had been 14. On a July afternoon 11 years before this story, Charlotte Hale had walked to the ornamental pond at the eastern edge of Whitfield Park to feed the ducks. She had done it 100 times. The bank had been muddy from rain. She had slipped. The water was deeper than it looked, and Charlotte had never learned to swim because no one had thought to teach her, because she was 14 and slight and always near the house, and the danger had not seemed real until it was the only thing that was real. Julian had been in London, 20 years old, at a card party in Mayfair. The laugh he had been laughing when it happened had been replaced in his memory by the sound of his mother's voice on the stairs when he arrived home, the way she said his name without finishing it. Charlotte's cameo, a small ivory oval carved with her profile, had been in the pocket of the coat she left on the bank. Julian had carried it in his waistcoat pocket every day since. It was what his hand found when it pressed against his chest, what his fingers closed around when his composure required reinforcement, what lay between his body and the world like a seal over a letter that could never be sent. He had not forgiven himself. Not for the card party, not for the laughter, not for being 20 and careless and alive, while his sister, who had been good and gentle, and who had trusted the world to hold her, was not. His mother had never spoken Charlotte's name after the funeral. The portrait in the gallery had been turned to the wall. The pond had been drained and filled. And Julian had learned, slowly and completely, that the cost of losing someone you were supposed to protect was a coldness so deep it became structure, became bone, became the face the county saw and mistook for arrogance. Miss Poole had not seen past the coldness. She had not tried. Her interest in the Marquis was the interest of a woman whose life had been organized around a specific kind of success, and the Marquis of Whitfield was that success made visible. Lady Whitfield had arranged the match with the efficiency of a woman who understood that her son's coldness was not a defect to be healed, but a surface to be maintained, and that Miss Poole, who did not ask questions, was the ideal surface for a surface. The engagement had proceeded on its expected course. The banns had been read. The chapel had been dressed. The guests had arrived. And the Marquis of Whitfield had stood at the altar that morning and told himself that the right thing and the felt thing were not the same, and that a man who had failed to protect one person did not deserve to choose for himself, and that he owed his name and his mother and the order she had maintained through her own grief the particular obedience of marrying well and wanting nothing. He had almost believed it. He had almost been able to stand there and say the words Mr. Talbot would ask him to say. And then the door at the back of the chapel had opened, and a woman in lavender had walked in, and the careful architecture of 11 years of control had shifted on its foundation like a house built on ground that was never as solid as it appeared. The weeks between the engagement and the wedding had been the cruelest of Cecilia's life. She had read aloud to Lady Penhurst. She had tended the garden at Hartwell, her hands in the soil, because the soil did not require her to explain her face. She had lain awake listening to the wind across the valley, and knowing, with a certainty that lived below thought, that the man who had told her not to call herself a companion was marrying someone else in 3 weeks, and that she would hear the bells from Hartwell's garden if the wind was right. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself she had no claim, no standing, no right to feel what she felt. She was a companion earning £40 a year. He was a marquis. The distance between those two facts was not a distance that feeling could cross, however persistent the feeling, however specific the ache. She had almost convinced herself. And then, the evening before the wedding, the third voicing found her. She had been sent to Whitfield Park with a final note of congratulation from Lady Penhurst. The house was in a state of careful frenzy, servants moving through the corridors with flowers and silver and the particular focused urgency that precedes an event designed to appear effortless. Cecilia had been standing in the entrance hall, waiting for Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, to take the letter, when she heard Miss Poole's voice drifting down the staircase from the first-floor landing. "Is the companion still lingering?" Miss Poole's tone was not cruel. It was something worse. It was bored. I should have thought she would have had the grace to absent herself for the day, at least. One does not bring the scullery cat to a wedding. A soft laugh from whoever stood beside her. Cecilia did not hear the reply. She did not need to. She set the letter on the hall table, and the hand that set it there was steady, and the face above the hand was still. And the only sign that anything at all had penetrated the composure she had spent 10 months building was a single hard breath, drawn through her nose, held, and released into the silence of the entrance hall, where no one was watching. She walked back to Hartwell in the dark. She sat in her room with the prayer book in her hands, and the scent of dried lavender rising from its pages. And she made a decision. She would go to the wedding. Not because she had been invited, because she had not. Not because she expected anything, because she did not. She would go because her father had taught her that a woman's presence in a room was not a thing to be ashamed of, and that the people who wished you absent were the precise people in front of whom you were required to stand. She would go in half-mourning because she was still grieving. And the grief was not a costume. It was the truest thing she owned. She would go, and she would stand at the back, and she would be seen, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she refused, on this particular morning, to be invisible. The chapel at Whitfield Park held 60 guests. 60 faces turned when the back door opened. 60 pairs of eyes found the woman in lavender against the far wall, and the silence that followed her entry was not the silence of welcome. It was the silence that precedes a verdict. Lady Whitfield's posture went rigid in the front pew. Miss Poole's chin lifted. Mr. Talbot paused, his finger marking the line in his book, and looked to the Marquis for instruction, because the clergyman had been in Whitfield's service for 20 years and knew the particular quality of stillness that meant the Marquis was about to do something no one could predict. Lord Whitfield was looking at Cecilia. His face had not changed. His hands were at his sides. The cameo pressed against his chest through the layers of wool and linen, and the weight of it was the weight of every choice he had deferred and every feeling he had stored. And every morning he had stood at the window watching a woman cross a gravel drive and told himself that watching was not choosing. It was choosing. He understood that now. Standing in a chapel dressed in white roses with a woman in ivory at his side and a woman in lavender at the back and the whole of the season's judgment arranged in the pews between them. He understood that he had chosen months ago, on a narrow path in the rain, when her voice had been hoarse and her eyes had been ringed with shadows, and she had called herself a companion, and he had told her not to. And the telling had been the truest sentence he had spoken in 11 years. "Lord Whitfield," Mr. Talbot said gently, "shall we continue?" The Marquis did not look at Mr. Talbot. He did not look at Miss Poole. He looked at the back of the chapel, at the woman in lavender who had pressed herself against the wall as though she did not deserve the space she occupied, and he spoke in the low, level voice that the front pew had learned meant the matter was decided and would not be revisited. "I choose Miss Ashworth." 4 words. The chapel held them the way a bell holds its own sound after the strike. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Mr. Talbot's hand stilled on the page. Miss Poole's veil trembled. And in the front pew, Lady Whitfield's composure, the great immaculate composure that had governed Whitfield Park for 30 years, fractured along a line no one had known was there. "Julian," her voice was sharp, cracked, the consonants no longer bitten but broken. "Julian, you cannot. You will not. This is not. She is. The sentence would not finish. The words she had used so fluently for months, the categories, the labels, the elegant machinery of dismissal collapsed under the weight of a choice they had not been designed to withstand. Lord Whitfield stepped away from the altar. He walked down the center aisle with the same measured stride he used for everything, and the 60 guests turned in their pews to watch him, and the silence was absolute, and the morning light through the east windows fell across his shoulders as he walked. He stopped in front of Cecilia Ashworth. She was looking at him now. She could not help it. Her hands were clasped around the prayer book, and her knuckles were white, and her breath was shallow, and her eyes, which had been on the floor since she entered, were on his face, and what she saw there was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was the face of a man who has carried a stone in his chest for 11 years and has just, in front of every person whose judgment he was raised to value, set it down. "Miss Ashworth," he said. Then he paused, and the pause was the pause of a man crossing a threshold. He knows he cannot recross, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Cecilia. Her name in his mouth. The first time. Spoken in a chapel full of witnesses, in front of the woman he was supposed to marry and the mother who had arranged it, in the plain, low voice of a man who has stopped performing and started telling the truth. Cecilia's breath caught. Her hand tightened on the prayer book. The dried lavender between its pages released a faint scent that only she could detect, the ghost of a garden she had lost, and she looked at the man standing before her and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and without mercy, that he was not cold. He had never been cold. He had been careful. The way a man is careful with a wound he cannot show anyone, and the care had looked like ice, because ice and discipline wear the same face from the outside. "My lord," she said, and her voice was steady, because Cecilia Ashworth's voice was always steady, even when the rest of her was not. "You are in the middle of a wedding." "I am not." His hand rose slowly, and he held it out to her, palm up, in the center of the aisle, in front of everyone. "I am at the beginning of one." Behind them, Mrs. Greville pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Mr. Talbot closed his book with the gentle firmness of a man who understood that the ceremony he had been asked to perform was not the ceremony that was going to happen. In the front pew, Lady Whitfield sat very still, her hands no longer folded, but gripping the edge of the pew, and her face held the expression of a woman who is realizing, for the first time, that the order she built her life inside was never the order her son needed, and that the companion she dismissed had been, all along, the person she could not afford to overlook. Miss Poole stood at the altar. Her veil had settled against her hair. Her face was pale, composed, and entirely still, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and carried no malice, only the sound of a woman setting down something she had held too tightly and finding to her own surprise that her hands did not close again. "Go," she said, to no one in particular, and to everyone. "Go, Lord Whitfield." He did not look back. He waited, his hand extended, his eyes on Cecilia, and the chapel waited with him, and the white roses on the pews released their scent into the morning air, as though even the flowers understood that something was being set right. Cecilia placed her hand in his. The warmth of his fingers closing around hers traveled up her arm and settled somewhere behind her ribs, in the exact place where the ache had lived for weeks, and the ache did not disappear. It changed. It became something she could hold, rather than something that held her. He led her out of the chapel. The morning light was gold on the gravel drive. The bells did not ring, because the ceremony they had been prepared for was not the ceremony that had occurred, and the silence in their place was better than any sound, because the silence was the sound of a verdict overturned. That evening, the sky above Whitfield Park turned the color of bruised plums, and the first summer rain arrived, gentle and persistent, tapping against the windows of the library, where Cecilia Ashworth sat in a chair that had been pulled close to the fire and covered with a wool blanket she had not asked for and would not have refused. Lord Whitfield sat across from her. He was reading, or pretending to read, a book he had not turned a page of in 20 minutes. The fire crackled. The rain spoke against the glass. Between them, on the small table that held a single candle and 2 cups of tea gone cool, the leather prayer book lay open to the page where the dried lavender rested, its color faded to the gray of old silver, its scent still faintly present if you leaned close enough and breathed. He had told her about Charlotte. Not all of it. Not yet, but enough. The pond, the July afternoon, the cameo in the pocket, and the 11 years of carrying it against his chest. He had told her in the same low voice he used for everything, and when it had finally broken, on the word her, meaning Charlotte, meaning the sister he could not save, Cecilia had not reached for him. She had sat with her hands in her lap and let the silence hold what words could not. Because she understood what it meant to lose someone whose absence restructured every room you walked into. Outside, the rain gentled. The fire settled into its embers. The candle on the table between them burned low, its light catching the edge of the lavender sprig in the prayer book. And Cecilia thought of her father, who had taught her that worth was not a thing the world bestowed, but a thing you carried with you into the rooms that did not expect you, and that the carrying was enough, even when it felt like it was not. Lord Whitfield set down his book. He looked at her across the small distance between their chairs, and the look was not the composed, withheld, deniable attention of the preceding months. It was plain. It was unguarded. It was the face she had glimpsed on the narrow path in the rain, the face he had spent 11 years building walls around, and the walls were down now, and what remained was a man sitting in a library in the rain, looking at a woman in lavender as though she were the first warm thing he had allowed himself to see in a very long time. "Stay," he said. Not a command this time. A question, barely voiced, offered into the quiet of the room the way one offers a hand to someone who might not take it. Cecilia looked at the prayer book. The lavender. The faint scent of a garden she had lost, and a father she had loved, and a life that had ended on a Tuesday in November, and had, against every expectation she had permitted herself, begun again on a Saturday in June in a chapel dressed in white roses, where a man in gray had spoken her name and meant it. "I am here," she said. The fire burned. The rain fell. The lavender held its scent between the pages, and the candle on the table between them did not go out. Thank you for staying with Cecilia until the end. If her story reached you, leave a quiet word below, and come back when you need to be reminded that the people who see us most clearly are not always the ones the world expects.